Yes, there is no water. All these obstructions up here, goodness. Hello, and thank you for braving this terrible weather to be here. It is a very important event, and I'm very happy to see all these faces here. My name is Renee Heberly. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Political Science here at UMass. The event tonight is being sponsored by the Organization for Marxist Studies. The general purpose of this student-run organization is to provide a student-oriented forum to discuss issues of social and political relevance to our student body directly, as well as to the international community of students. Our next event will take place this Monday at 7 o'clock in Campus Center Room 165. It will be a discussion of the role of the PLO in the struggle of the Palestinian people to establish a homeland. On December 8th, we are planning an open mic night, which will be a sharing of original political culture from members of the Valley community. The location of that event will be announced at least 1 week prior to the date. Tonight, with very special thanks to Little Flags Theater and to the 5 College Program in Peace and World Security Studies, we are very happy to have Dr. Michael Parenti with us. Dr. Parenti has a PhD in political science from Yale University and is taught at numerous universities around the United States. He is the author of several books and articles. His books include Democracy for the Few and The Power and the Powerless. And his latest work, Inventing Reality, the Politics of the Mass Media, is directly relevant to his topic tonight. We are very happy to have Dr. Michael Parenti speaking on anti-Sovietism in the media, an obstacle to peace. Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice to be here, and thank you for braving the snowstorm to get here. At least I did. I assume you did too. While American anti-communist and anti-Soviet policies have been portrayed in the media and by government as being understandable defenses against the Soviet. Did I do something wrong here? Just wanted to get this. Move it back a little bit. Just move it back. That's it. No, it's just I couldn't see half the audience with us. Okay, great. You always have to. Certain concessions to the media, always. Okay, there we go. Right. As a threat to Soviet aggrandizement, that is, that they were defensive responses to something called the Cold War, and that Cold War started in 1946 or so when Russia proved itself to be an expansionist and menacing power. That's the standard scenario. In response to that aggrandizement and that menacing, we alerted ourselves to the Soviet menace, and we educated the American public to that menace. And we reacted to it with the NATO shield, with the armaments, with interventions in various countries, the Truman Doctrine and all that stuff. Now, very recently, the American Historical Association published a set of documents that were rather intriguing, which they got out of the State Department under the Freedom of Information Act, which shows that people in the State Department never believed that the Soviets had any intention or any interest or any capability of invading Western Europe in the late 1940s or in the 50s or 60s or today, for that matter. But nevertheless, and it's a kind of mind-blowing thing for that generation of us who were raised in that post-war era and heard constantly about the Soviet menace in Europe and were treated to visions of Soviet troops marching under the Arc de Triomphe and all that sort of thing, and told that what we needed above anything else was a NATO shield. What I want to point out tonight is that anti-Sovietism began well long before what was called the Cold War and long before the Soviet Union became the kind of power it is today. It really goes back to a time before there ever was the Soviet Union. All through the 19th century, you will find that the press, joined by the pulpit, the politicians, the police, the professors, and the plutocracy, all of them propagated this picture that American life was facing a certain danger, and that was the danger of syndicalism, socialism, radicalism, anarchism, communism, all of which tended to get lumped together as one great danger to the American way of life. Any proposed departure from the capitalist social order was characterized as a departure from all order itself and a plunge into anarchy. Thus, as early as 1880, Roscoe Conkling could hail President Ulysses Grant. Roscoe Conkling was the boss who made Ulysses Grant, but anyway, he could hail him then as, quote, an eternal foe of communism, lawlessness, and disorder, lumping communism with disorder and lawlessness. So that any move toward another social order, an alternative social order, is really characterized, or rather the end of the capitalist social order, as I said, is characterized as the end of all social order. Capitalism was equated with true Americanism, while socialism was depicted as a kind of an alien virus that affected the American body politic. In fact, by the way, in the late 19th century, probably some of the most powerful socialist movements, most active movements in the world were going on in the U.S. Certainly some of the most militant worker struggles were going on. Enough so to catch Marx's attention. Marx wrote to Engels, he said, what's with the American workers? It's rather unusual, rather massive strikes. Well, then came a most remarkable and most significant historical event, which changed the course of world history. And that was the Russian Revolution of 1917. The specter that had haunted Europe, the specter of communism, was now being realized, was being embodied. Here was not just a workers' rebellion, there had been many workers' rebellions and many workers' revolutions. Here was one that succeeded and took over a rather large country. And there's a remarkable correspondence that took place between Secretary of State Lansing and President Woodrow Wilson, in which Lansing wrote that the Bolsheviks are wanting in political virtue. They would preach to the common man that one could reach an elevated height by dint of political means rather than by hard work. This would be a most unfortunate, I'm paraphrasing from memory, this would be a most unfortunate example to the common man in our country and other countries. They were very much aware that this revolution that had taken place had torn the fabric of bourgeois history. There was now a different kind of social force actually taking over and commanding state power. By the way, is this being videotaped? Did you say it was? I was wondering why the cameras... I mean, I couldn't see a camera, but I see the lights blinding me. And if I'm going to suffer the lights, there better be a tape. But otherwise, shut the lights. Oh, okay. Well, there is video being made. You got all that on tape. What can you do? So from the very beginning, they saw a threat. It wasn't Stalin's divisions. It wasn't Khrushchev's missiles. Long before that, when it was a country which itself was then invaded by 14 Western capitalist countries, including the United States, to overthrow this newly instituted Soviet government. From the very beginning, the Western leaders understood that this was a threat. Not a threat to democracy, because half of them didn't have any democracies themselves, and they felt perfectly at home instituting brutal colonial rules throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America with no concern for democracy. Not a threat to the world's stability in the sense that this was going to cause further wars, because the worst and most vicious wars were being fought among the capitalists themselves for markets and colonies and such. They were the destabilized. It was a threat to capitalism. It was a threat to that process of capital accumulation, which is the substance and mainstay of this society and every other capitalist society. It was presenting an alternative social order, one which used the land, the labor, the technology, and the capital of that society, not for the private capital accumulation process, but for social needs in a planned manner, which, with all its imperfections and problems, was decidedly and still is a different kind of way of organizing your political economy. A different kind of society, and the end of a capitalist class society. The propaganda war against the Red Menace then intensified soon after the Russian Revolution. I want to quote historian Robert Murray in his book, The Red Scare. Anti-Bolshevik testimony was played up in the columns of the nation's newspapers, and once again the reading public was fed on highly colored tales of free love, nationalization of women. By the way, that was a common story in the media in those days, that Lenin nationalized women. The women were put on nationalization. They became part of public ownership, and you can, I don't know exactly how that worked, but nationalization of women, bloody massacres and brutal atrocities. Stories were circulated that the victims of the Bolshevik madmen customarily had been roasted to death in furnaces, scalded with live steam, torn to pieces on racks, or hacked to bits with axes. Newspaper editors never tired of referring to the Russian Reds as assassins and madmen, quote, quote, human scum, crime mad, and beasts. This is Murray. In the aftermath, by the way, of World War I, some rather extraordinary things were happening in the United States itself. 2 million workers were on strike, including 500,000 coal miners, 350,000 steel workers, and immediately the press began to link the domestic unrest to the Soviet menace, to, after all, delegitimate the domestic unrest, and to alarm the public with sensational headlines like, quote, Red Peril here, quote, Plan Bloody Revolution, quote, Want Washington Government Overturned. A special Justice Department publicity bureau was set up. Very interesting. And its function was to plant stories in newspapers about a Moscow-directed plot to overthrow the U.S. government. By the way, that process is still going on. I mean, U.S. government agencies are still planting stories, feeding them to the media about anti-communist phobias. The FBI has done that. The CIA is forbidden by law to do it, but they do. The CIA often plants the stories abroad, and by what's called a process of blowback, the story gets back into the U.S. They'll plant a story. That story they planted of Cuban troops massacring innocent people in Angola, villages in Angola, was a total CIA disinformation fabrication story planted in Western Europe, but it gets picked up in the newspapers, and then U.S. journalists and wire services pick those stories up, thinking they're from independent journalists, and we're treated to them here. So the CIA indirectly plants here. So there are people who do this all the time. There also occurred at that time a Justice Department action. Raids. The Justice Department, assisted by state and local police, hit concurrently 20 cities, hundreds of raids, arresting thousands of leftists, including many trade union militants. The key organization working at that time was a group called the Special Bureau of Investigation under a young Georgetown lawyer. In 1919, this was named J. Edgar Hoover. It was later changed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But as early as 1919, Hoover was doing this sort of thing. He had quite a long career. To these raids, in which hundreds of people were deported without any due process, thousands were thrown in jail without any due process, the New York Times hailed the Palmer raids with this headline: "Reds plotted countrywide strike. Arrests exceed 5,000. The Philadelphia Public Ledger greeted the Boston police strike, which occurred soon after that. Bolshevism in the United States is no longer a specter, meaning it was a reality. And the Wall Street Journal headline screamed, "Lenin and Trotsky are on their way." Now, there was a nightmare. There was something very frightening happening. But the nightmare wasn't revolution, it was reaction, and it was a real one. And the job was done. Under the Palmer raids, under the combined force of industry, government, and press, the major strikes were broken. Wages were driven down, the open shop was restored, and the ranks of the unions were decimated. And profit levels were secured. The government industry press campaign against the Red Menace continued all through the 1920s into the 1930s and intensified in about 1936, 37, 38. Again, as the struggles of the CIO and industrial workers intensified, so then did the red baiting hysteria about Moscow-directed plots, about Reds infiltrating our institutions and our life, and that sort of thing. At the same time, by the way, this contrasted very sharply the media's treatment of the Bolshevik menace at home and abroad, contrasted very sharply with their treatment of Mussolini and Hitler, both of whom were treated rather positively. Mussolini in the 20s absolutely gushingly, a strong man who would shape Italy up, get the trains running on time, and put things in order. A fascist who was a solid patriot, who would get rid of the forces of disorder and anarchy, roll back the Red Menace, and that sort of thing, which is why he was treated so nicely. Hitler was a man who had ideas full of a lot of bluster and shouting, but really not as mean as he sounded. His anti-Semitism was mostly for display. There was a whole give Adolf a chance school that arose in American journalism at that time. Give Adolf a chance, he'll do okay. What Hitler and Mussolini did when they came into power, and by the way, I document that more fully in my book, Inventing Reality. I have about a page on that. I don't want to go into it now. What they did when they came into power, one of the untouched subjects in modern American scholarship on fascism, the obsession today is who supported Hitler, who gave the support, who was behind them, and what never seems to be dealt with, the key question, is what did they do when they came into power? What interests did they support? And what they both did, what both Hitler and Mussolini did when they came into power, was abolish all independent trade unions, smash all opposition newspapers, throw political opponents into jail, round up and murder large numbers of them, cut wages by 1/3 to 1/2, increase investments in military spending dramatically, increase cartel profits, cut inheritance taxes for the rich, cut taxes for the rich. In Italy, child labor was reintroduced, and roll back a number of other protections and democratic gains which labor had won, such as Social Security insurance, occupational safety laws, and abuses which the Italians had thought they had eliminated over a generation before returned to the work site. So fascism was a very regressive and costly thing for the working class and was not supported by that working class. The business-owned press, therefore, not surprisingly, while denouncing the Soviet Union as a menace to civilization and all that was right, manifested an open admiration for fascist Italy and a kind of cool and rather warm tolerance for giving Adolf a chance in Nazi Germany. After a while, as both of these countries showed themselves to be aggressors against Western capitalist interests, after a while, then opinions began to get a little more negative in the press toward them, after Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia and Hitler's threats directed toward the West. But to the very end, don't forget, Western diplomats were never unkind to Hitler, even after they got into a war with him. There was what was called the Droll War, or the Sitzkrieg, instead of the Blitzkrieg I was called. That is the sit struggle, no fighting. There was very little fighting, because what they still expected and what they still wanted was for Hitler to move east and to attack the Soviet Union, which indeed he did, and which indeed became the major focus of World War II. 7 out of every 10 German soldiers who were killed in World War II were killed fighting on the Eastern Front. The Soviets alone had over twice the number of divisions committed to that war than all the Western Allies put together. The major fighting was there, and the victory was pretty much won in the East. It was not, if you recall, until June of 1944 that the Normandy invasion took place, and the war ended in July or May of 45. So the European battles really were less than a year. The anti-Sovietism then that we saw in the press continued throughout the 1950s and 60s, very strong in the late 40s, by the way, when the Cold War, again, very much like in 1919, 1920, when the Cold War was heated up in 1947-48, you also had a full-scale attack on the CIO and a red-baiting attack of the CIO, and Taft-Hartley was passed, and the stipulation of Taft-Hartley was that Reds in the unions had to be purged. And the CIO, to demonstrate its anti-communist credentials, purged some 4 million of its own unions, membership, unions which amounted to a membership of about 4 million, kicked them out of its own unions, and turned to the bosses and said, see, we've done that. We're now free of the communist-dominated unions. And in fact, there were unions that had communist leadership. You have to say communist-dominated. The impression is of some kind of coercion. What was meant was that communists worked and organized and fought very hard in those unions and brought unionization to workshops in very tough situations and bettered the work conditions of workers in those unions. Those unions were kicked out because the people in the CIA thought that the reason the bosses didn't like them was because they were communists in the unions. And once they got rid of the communists, then we would all be friends. And once they got rid of the communists, then the bosses really stuck it to them with Taft-Hartley and began busting their shops. Because it wasn't that they were communists that was offensive, it's that they were unions. And those unions were cutting into their profits. Those unions were taking a larger portion of the wealth that the worker created and giving it back to the worker. And that means less for the guys at top, less for the Mellons, the Morgans, the DuPonts, and the Rockefellers. And to this day, you better remember that it's not whether you're a communist or not, it's whether or not you take any stance that's in a progressive direction which threatens the prerogatives of capital. And if you turn, you say, we've purged ourselves of the Reds, that's great. What you've done is you've done your enemy's work. You've cast out people who are fighting the same cause as you, and you've weakened yourself. And once the CIO did that, the CIO never recovered. In 1947, 35% of the workforce in this country was unionized. Today, it's down to 18%. After they purged their unions and amputated themselves to please the bosses and prove their anti-communism and maintain their credibility, you see, as good Americans, they really got it stuck to them, and they have never recovered that momentum and that power that they had from the 1930s to the early 40s. All of this was hailed in the press as a great victory for Americanism. During the brief period of détente, 10 years, not such a brief period, the press's treatment of the Soviet Union was mollified, and generally, the anti-Sovietism never disappeared. Portrayals of life in the Soviet Union always continued to be portrayals of drabness, dreariness, joyless, people manacled to a system that they did not want, restive, oppressed populations, monochromatic, totalitarian, not pluralistic like us. By the way, pluralistic America looks like it's voting for English as an official language. Totalitarian Russia publishes books in about 120 languages. There are about 16 official languages. There's one nationwide language, which is Russian, which is used everywhere. But you go to Soviet Azerbaijani and you could see street signs in Azerbaijani. You could see films in Azerbaijani. You go to Georgia. The Georgian film industry is, it turns out hundreds of films a year. You can see television in your native languages. You have poetry, culture, art, theater in your native languages, including Yiddish. By the way, there's Yiddish theater and Yiddish literature in the Soviet Union. You tell me where there's Yiddish theater and Yiddish literature in the U.S. Few places in Brooklyn, Flatbush maybe, and that's about it. It's died. Well, when 6 million American Jews assimilate and no longer speak Yiddish, this is called a victory for assimilation and Americanization, and is so hailed. When 2.5 million Soviet Jews assimilate and less of them speak Yiddish, this is called the crushing and the death of Yiddish culture. In fact, Yiddish culture and even Hebrew culture is more alive in the Soviet Union than it is in pluralistic America. In pluralistic America, we're told, why don't you learn to speak English? If you're here, you should all speak English. All the signs will be in English. If you really carried that, I wondered how far you could carry that. A sushi bar would have to be called a fish and rice bar, wouldn't it? It's a foreign word, Japanese word. Taco would have to be called something else. Beef and crust pie or something. And pizza is not an English word. Pizza will have to be changed to tomato pie. But it looks like in California, all the Spanish signs will be taken down and English will be safe and saved. In pluralistic, diverse America, where we have a cultural diversity and freedom. That, by the way, I think points out something. That what the function of our portrayals of Soviet society has been is to be kind of like an inverted mirror image of our own problems. As the U.S. economy in the 70s sank deeper into stagflation, stories began to appear about worsening economic conditions endured by the Soviets. The message was, no matter how bad we have it, they have it even worse. In fact, Jack Anderson said that in his column. We may have it bad, but they have it even worse. And it was a column on inflation. As inflation reached double-digit levels in the U.S., stories about inflation in the Soviet Union began to appear in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, U.S. News and World Report. A closer reading of these inflation stories, which the average reader doesn't give, but if you're writing a book on the media, you give them a closer reading, as I did, revealed to me that, and you'd have to get down to paragraph 13 or 14, that basic necessities in the Soviet Union, such as food, rent, transportation, medical care, and education, were strictly price-controlled and subsidized by the state and had not at all been subject to any kind of inflation. What was the inflation? Generally, it was on luxury articles like automobiles, caviar, vodka, expensive clothes, and things of that sort. In September '81, the New York Daily News ran a story, headline, "Soviet Prices Soaring." That was the headline, with a subheading that read, "Gas, booze, cost comrades a pretty kopeck." Love that. Hey, I love that kind of journalism. That's what you call your upbeat. Only in the last two paragraphs of that report do we discover that prices were actually lowered or held steady on most essentials, including food. The price of bread in the Soviet Union has not changed since 1928. The price of riding on the subway in the Soviet Union in Moscow is still 7 cents or 5 kopecks. And it's quite a ride if you ever go to the USSR. I took it, except I was too terrorized I couldn't read the signs. One, they learned to write. What was that? Steve Martin said when his trip to Paris, he said, we go all the way to Paris. You'd think they'd have the decency to speak English to us. But we still hear, by the way, stories about the troubled Soviet economy. The Washington Post writes that the Soviets are suffering, quote, production difficulties in the oil industry, and the Kremlin is trying to prepare the population for a period of uncertainty and difficulties. In fact, heavy industry production in the Soviet Union has been doing well. Production growth is no longer going 11, 12%. It's down to more like 4 or 5%. But you see, there's another remarkable thing. Last year, that economic recovery we had in this country was a remarkable economic recovery, because I picked up the New York Times financial page and it said 1% growth. Recovery slow. I said, I'll say slow. 1% growth is recession. 1% growth is a slow, and it said, but steady and hopeful recovery. So when the U.S. economy has a 1% growth, that's a slow but steady recovery. When the Soviet economy drops from 9 and 10% down to 4%, this is called a crash and a failure of the economy. Again, you see, the facts do not really speak for themselves. It depends on how they are framed. Wages of Soviet miners and payment to pensioners were recently increased. Wages in general have climbed 41%, real wages, since 1970, along with benefits for maternity leave, aid to large families. None of the media have seen fit to publicize these facts. Likewise, none of the news media has publicized the fact that every Soviet citizen is guaranteed a right to a job, and there's no unemployment to speak of, that every Soviet citizen has the right to change his or her job, that Soviet men can retire at the age of 60, and Soviet women at the age of 55. In fact, they do retire. They're required to retire. You then receive a pension, and you are then allowed to get another job if you so want. You don't have to. That you talk to the average Soviet citizen, unlike the average American citizen, and including people in fairly affluent incomes, they're not sitting there in fear of, will I be able to maintain myself in my old age? If you want to know what's on the mind of many Americans, not just blue-collar workers, I'm talking about friends of mine, a woman I know is in realty who makes $70,000 a year, a friend of mine who's a shrink who makes $100,000 a year. You know what's on their mind? What's going to happen to me when I retire? What's going to happen to me when this income ends? Will I be able to maintain my standard of living? Will I still be able to go out to a restaurant and have a vacation now and then? Will I end up in that furnished room with the naked electric bulb over me? It's an image that haunts people as they get up there in years. As they said, middle age is when thoughts of passion turn to thoughts of pension. Well, in socialist societies, I talked to my friend Otto Jorg from the German Democratic Republic, GDR, and I said, do people in your country and do you fear a retirement the way people here do? You worry about will you be able to maintain yourself? He said, no, not at all. He's by the way, head of the GDR News Bureau in Washington and covers news and works awfully hard. He said, I'm looking forward to retirement. He said, quite the opposite. You envy them. You walk by and you see people sitting around and they're smiling and laughing, and they've retired, and you've got to go off to work. You envy them, and there isn't that kind of one of the essence of capitalist society is insecurity. The essence of capitalist society is that you must keep going after that wage. If you don't keep going after that wage, then there's no exploitation of the wage earner. And so one is never really secure here unless one has very substantial wealth. And even then you worry that there may be revolutions that will come and take that wealth away from you. No joke, the governor of New York State some years ago sent in the state troopers in Attica, you remember? And the state troopers went in there and massacred. It was called the biggest massacre of Americans by Americans since Wounded Knee, 1890. And they went in there, and when they turned to Governor Nelson Rockefeller, and they said, why did you do it that way? Why did you send those troopers in with blazing guns killing these guys? The prisoners had rebelled and they taken hostages. But the prisoners had a few skivs and a few clubs, and that was it. They weren't really armed. And the guys went in there killing. They even killed some of their own guards, 7 or 8 of their own guards, because they went shooting so wild. And Rockefeller's answer was, they were revolutionaries. They were preaching a doctrine of revolution, and who knows where that could lead? The governor of New York. And who has more to fear from a revolution than a Rockefeller? So it's a very real thing even for the most wealthy, the specter of revolution. The American public was not told that every Soviet citizen has a right to free education to the highest level of her or his ability, that they have free medical care, which is something U.S. citizens do not have. There's still about an estimated 40 million Americans who have no medical coverage of any kind, and millions of others who think they have comprehensive coverage, who, when hit with a serious illness, find that they go bankrupt anyway. These are tough things to hear. I mean, this flies right in the face of everything that we have been taught. And Soviet citizens have subsidized housing and transportation. As hunger increased in the United States, stories began appearing which said that the Soviets are unable to feed their people. I'm practically quoting Dan Rathers on there. NBC, CBS reported this. Flora Lewis in the New York Times said their economy is falling apart and they are unable to feed their people. They need our grain. The sales of grain to the Soviet Union are probably the best publicized, best propagandized grain deals in the history of Western trade, of world trade. The truth of the matter is that the Soviets raise more than enough grain to feed their people, but what they have been doing in the last 20 years is converting increasingly toward larger supplies of meat and dairy, which in the Soviet Union and in the West is mistakenly treated as an improved diet, despite the scientific evidence which shows that a higher meat diet is not necessarily the best thing for you. Nevertheless, meat consumption in the Soviet Union has gone up substantially. It takes 10 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of meat, and that's why they import grain. They use it almost all for fodder and for the production of meat and dairy. The idea that the Soviet Union can transform its country from a nation of half-starved peasants, illiterate workers, and whatever else, into a nation of scientists, engineers, technicians, artists, and intellectuals and whatever, that they could do that without an adequate agricultural base is really, when you think about it, is really not logical. They have agricultural production problems because only about 8% of their land is suitable for agricultural usage. Most of it is either too arid or too arctic or too cold. And so they got shortchanged while they're very richly endowed on other resources, minerals and oil and all that stuff, timber, and probably more than any other country in that sense. They are poorly endowed in agriculture. The most richly endowed country in the world in agriculture is the United States. There is no place on the globe where you get this stretch of temperate land, going from Appalachia clear across to the Rockies, and then on the other side of the Rockies, all of that western coast, a huge continent of agricultural land to be able to produce. There's no place in Brazil, which is jungle, there's no place in Africa, there's no place in Europe that has that stretch of real estate that can produce crops with the richness and abundance that our country does. Although that richness and abundance is being depleted by mass agricultural methods which are destroying the soil and losing topsoil and all that sort of thing. That abundance may be in for a crash eventually, but at this point I'm just making comparisons there why we might have a wheat surplus and why they may import wheat for meat. That kind of story, whatever else you think about the Soviet Union as a society, you don't have to like them. You don't have to say, well, I prefer living here. No one's asking you to move there. What we're asking you to do, though, is to develop an image that's a little better than the Reader's Digest image. To develop what psychologists call differential object appraisal. To not see a simple stereotype and understand that that is a very complex society which has had a very harsh history. It has not maybe developed the institutions that you might like that exist in Sweden, with nice little opposition parties and all that sort of thing. It has not had the luxury of Sweden's history, but it has a history of its own, and it has accomplishments of its own, and it has a humanity of its own, which should be looked at in something better than the evil empire cartoon image that we have of the country. And we should be able not only to make critical remarks about the Soviet Union, but we should be able to countenance positive statements about it. And that is what the U.S. press cannot do. You cannot find in the U.S. media a positive statement about some social development or social formation in any socialist or revolutionary country. That's simply not what you can find. I mean, of any significance. I could take that back and say, I did read an article about 4 years ago about the bus system in Budapest, where they said it was a very good bus system in Hungary. I mean, occasionally, I read an article once in the New York Times about 6 years ago about the Sandinista government in Managua and how they wanted to plant trees in Managua and refurbish the city with a lot of trees. And without any negative little snide statement in it. It's just a straight story about that. Occasionally, something like that will come in. But generally, the overall thrust is this ideological pounding that we've been getting again and again. And what we have to do is be less selfless. We have to be more selfish. We are too selfless. We are too concerned about whether other people hear both sides of the story. Do the Russians hear both sides? Do the Cubans hear both sides? Do those Chinese hear both sides of the story? We have to start really asking ourselves, being a little more selfish and be concerned about ourselves. It is your mind that is getting boxed in by your media. It is our minds that are being affected. This is our struggle, and we have to ask, do we hear both sides? Do we have access to other areas and other sources of information? By the way, that question came up in Reykjavik. Do you remember Gorbachev made the statement that while we were supposedly there for an arms discussion, President Reagan turned the whole matter to a question of pluralism and our society and their society, and why don't you have things open? And we said we would stop jamming your radio messages if you would allow access of our radio messages. We said, Gorbachev saying, we have taken your movies in, why don't you see some of our movies? It's true. You can go to the Soviet Union and see American movies. When I was there, Soviets were all lining up to see Tootsie with Dustin Hoffman, which was a very good movie with a very intelligent script in it. Gorbachev could have gone further. He didn't. He could have talked about books. He could have talked about novelists. When you go to the Soviet Union and you hear them talking about American novelists, and you realize nobody in your group could name one novelist. When you go to the Soviet Union, as I did as head of a delegation of economists and political scientists, and you turn to our guide Natasha, who had a PhD in economics, and some of our guys turned to her with that look of compassion and supplication as you would to anybody who is deprived, and you say, Natasha, do you get the chance to read any Western, any American economists? And she said, well, I read Schumpeter and Samuelson and Magdoff and O'Connor and Milton Friedman, even, the reactionary. And they all said, oh. And then she said, have you read Navroshka, Batoshka, Voruska, Baraska, Boryoshka? And of course, they hadn't read these guys, and none of us read them, couldn't pronounce it, didn't know who she was talking about. But we were concerned as to whether or not she was, and that's true, by the way, through all the social sciences. What I would like to do then is explain something about this anti-Sovietism. I believe it persists because it's very functional. It fulfills certain very real functions in the existing class society. For all its pretensions at neutrality and objectivity, the truth of the matter is that the press doesn't operate in a social vacuum. It's not only closely sympathetic to the corporate class and the ruling elites, it is part of that class. I mean, the major media in this country are themselves part of corporate America and corporations. They're owned by the same wealthy interests that control the rest of the corporate world, that invest in the third world, that were threatened by the Russian Revolution of 1917 and by every other revolution from Nicaragua to the Philippines to Attica. And so they generally present a ruling class perspective. They are for multinational corporations. They treat multinational corporate investment in the third world as a good thing. That's something that will supposedly uplift these people, not take their land away and use it for cash crop export, not exploit their labor and pay them 20 cents an hour. No, not that, but something that's essentially good for those countries. They are for capital and against labor. They are for capitalism and against socialism. They are for the status quo and against revolutionary change or any reformist or fundamental change of any kind. And this class bias frames much of what they do and how they see things. And it operates as a relentless propaganda theme, but also not just as an explicit propaganda theme, but as an implicit assumption and a conceptual framework. Keeping that in mind, I'll offer the following conclusions. One, the Red Menace theme that is so assiduously propagated by the ruling elites in this country is neither a foolish fantasy nor a product of mass hysteria. Those quotes about Lenin and Trotsky are on their way. That's not hysteria, although its goal, one of its aims, is to produce fantasy and hysteria in the minds of the mass of people. Two, that red menace, that hysteria is not a mass thing. It doesn't come from the masses. It's something that is fed from the top down. As I said at the very beginning of my talk, from the pulpit, from the police, from the professors, from the plutocracy, and most strategically from the press, and certainly from the government itself. The press often, by the way, is just the purveyor of this. You know, the leaders get up and they say, this is happening, that's happening, the Reds are there, the Red Bear's at the gate and all that, and the press dutifully and uncritically reports that, and so they've got whatever is the new line. The people didn't suddenly just get up and clamor for a red witch hunt. The people didn't suddenly just get up and say, oh, let's arrest all the trade union leaders in 1919. There was no mass demonstrations of the people saying, get the Reds out from among us. The people didn't call for the return of Cold War II. The American people didn't call for an increase in military spending and a cuts in the human services. That was something that was done from the top down. So that climate of opinion, that climate of confrontation, that climate of threat is created from the top down. The second point is the existing social order does face a serious threat. Not from without, but from within. Not from communists, but from within the capitalist system itself, from its unresolved crises of underemployment, overproduction, stagnation, inflation, poverty. And by the way, inflation was still with us. We had inflation as a problem under Richard Nixon. 4% was considered inflation. That cuts into your real wages. In 10 years, 4% can knock out about half your income, your real earnings. Today it said Reagan solved inflation because once it got up to 12 and 13% and it got back down to 4, everybody says, oh, inflation's been solved. Unemployment used to be a problem when it reached 4, and when anything over 3 or 4%, we started saying we had an unemployment problem. Today, once unemployment got up to 12% and is now down to 7, it's being treated as, okay, 7% is an acceptable thing. And that's the official count on unemployment. And the official count means that if you work a couple of hours in 1 week, you're counted as unemployed. If you work 1 day of that week, you're counted as employed. So there's a tremendous unemployment. There's a tremendous problem. They've got problems they can't solve. They've got an economic crisis. And they face demonstrations, opposition. They face problems of legitimation. They face these things, massive strikes, much more massive than you think. Right now, how many people know that there are 22,000 steel workers out? Not on a strike, actually. They're locked out. But the press always calls it a strike. Even when management locks out workers because they don't want a contract, don't want to negotiate, won't give them a contract, it's still called a strike, generally. Now, this red menace that's propagated by the military, industrial, governmental, and media complex, that's what I call it, serves the function of telling people that it's worse anywhere else. One of the first things you will hear is, where is it any better? The Soviets have it worse. If you go around and lecture, you go, I'm dealing with the subject right now, but generally I might talk about Reaganomics. Talk about any subject. Almost the first question you get is, talk about the Russians. What about them? It's worse there. It's worse there. So why criticize here? And you could say, maybe it is worse there. And by the way, I don't think that the evidence indicates that in terms of economic conditions. But maybe it is worse there. What the hell's that got to do with you here? I mean, if you had abuses and problems here at University of Massachusetts, would someone get up and say, it's worse at the University of New Hampshire? Which it probably is. But what are you supposed to say to that? You're supposed to go, oh, that's okay then. Oh, then let them double my tuition because they're tripling it in New Hampshire. Oh, that's all right. Oh, then we shouldn't complain. Oh, it's worse there. But that's the first, I tell you, man, you can go anywhere in the country now. That's the first question that'll come up. Where do you think it's any better? Now, I think it's better in Cuba, where I injured my leg, a very serious injury, my Achilles tendon, and I went to a hospital, and I got an operation, and nobody gave me that examination you get in the U.S., the first examination you get when you go into an emergency clinic, and you can be bleeding from 3 places, the examination of your wallet, to see if you got medical coverage, and if you don't, you're sent to another hospital, you're dumped on the public hospital, which may be across town while you're still bleeding. It was better in Cuba where I got that operation, and I didn't have to pay a penny, and I came back here with a cast, and I tried to get an orthopedic doctor, and I couldn't, and I could pay. I said, I'll pay. You don't understand, I'll pay. And they said, oh, we know you'll pay. We don't take any other kind of patient. But they're all booked, and I finally got some guy who just come out of medical school, and I hobbled into his office, and he looked at the cast, and he said, leave it on another week. That's $50. I can tell you that $50. I never resented paying $50 so much. It was better in Cuba. In a poor country, I got good medical care. In a rich country, I'm treated like a beggar and a pariah. It was better in Cuba, where I didn't see any kids with swollen bellies and hungry and begging. I didn't see any people begging. It was better in Cuba than it was in Washington, D.C., where I live, and I walk down the street and I see people in total misery and disorientation standing there begging for food, begging for money, sleeping in hallways. I see that in the richest country in the world. That's where it was better. And when you talk about freedom, that's freedom. And when you talk about oppression, that's oppression. Sleeping in a doorway is oppression. You want to know what oppression is? Then sleep in the doorways of the land of the free and the home of the brave, and you'll know what oppression is. You want to know what oppression is? Then think about the guys who sit there wondering if they're going to blow their brains out because they can't pay the mortgage on their house and they can't feed their kids and they see the whole thing falling apart. That's where it's better. And those are real things, and that's part of freedom. Now the military, no, you don't have to. The red menace that's propaganda, though, tries to direct popular discontent. Don't think you got it bad because it's worse over there, you see. And also there's a menace out there. And don't make too much waves here. We are in very serious times. What does Reagan do in his 6 years? What has he been doing? He has been distracting people from the real issues of their lives. He has refused to talk about human services, about underemployment, about the crises of the cities, except occasionally to make a little quip, like the other night where he talked about some guy who was living in a $36,000 rental in a welfare hotel. And saying, that sounds pretty good to me, not pointing out that the price was a rip-off on the government, which he should have been looking at, and the guy was living in a cramped, crowded, dirty little room in that hotel because no one else would take him anywhere else. And for all those years, what has he been doing? He's been telling you about Gaddafi, and terrorism, and the Soviet menace, and the evil empire, and our defenses, and this, and that, and out there, and over there. Rally around the flag, forget the realities of your own life. And this is what the ruling elites have to do. They have to continually, strenuously bring us back to the fantasies of their world, because the people keep floating off into reality. And that's a problem for them. The people keep floating off concerned about jobs and homes and the education of their kids and their medical bills and that sort of thing. And so that's what he's been doing. And that red menace is very important for that function. It is very functional. Yesterday it was the Bolsheviks, the anarchists, the subversives, the communists. Today it's the terrorists. It's the KGB infiltrators. You remember that all through 1982 and 83? The peace movement, it's infiltrated by the KGB. Those millions of Americans out there are just mindless puppets. Those millions of Americans who are calling for a bilateral, verifiable nuclear freeze, those millions of Americans who voted in referenda in 9 states and in hundreds and hundreds of townships across the country for a nuclear freeze that was virtually, in its wording, identical. By the way, the Soviets passed a nuclear freeze, another hidden story, another story that the media never told us. And the Supreme Soviet unanimously passed a proposition supporting a nuclear freeze. The Politburo of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union unanimously passed a proposition calling for bilateral verifiable nuclear freeze. A freeze on all weapons, testing and production, and then you can start bringing it down. Verifiable with teams, on-site inspections, all that sort of thing. And when those millions do it here, the President of the United States gets up and he red baits them, and he marginalizes them, and he trivializes them, and he ignores them. Just as Hitler used the Jews. You know, Hitler would turn to a country that was under a real internal threat, and that threat again was the crisis of capitalism in Weimar Germany. A crisis of a runaway inflation, of unemployment, of an economy that wasn't working, of a few giant cartels that was squeezing and strangling that economy. And Hitler turned around and said, you know who's causing your problems? He turned to the workers and the poor, and he said, it's the Jewish bankers. And he turned to the small merchants and he said, you know who's causing your problems? It's the big Jewish department store owners and the Jewish trade unions. And he turned to the farmers and he said, it's the Jewish usurers. And he turned to the veterans and the military and he said, it's the communists and the Jewish communists and the Jewish trade unions, all that sort of thing. The conjuring up of irrelevant enemies to evade that confrontation and challenge that we should be making. The Germans knew they were getting ripped off, but if they moved against the cartels, they would be moving in a genuinely revolutionary direction. And so they chose to move against irrelevant enemies. At least a substantial minority of them did. The specter of socialism haunts the United States not so much as a direct revolutionary threat. I mean, you can't say that socialism is about to come to state power in the U.S. But since 1917, as an example of another social order that is free of unemployment, serious inflation, and serious deprivation. As it becomes, ladies and gentlemen, more evident that capitalism will not and cannot solve the basic life maintenance problems of its people, that capitalism causes greater immiseration among peoples in the third world, that the growth of capital investment in the third world has not led to a development in those worlds, and that's why I never call them the developing countries. I don't know why people use those phrases. They are the maldeveloped countries. That what comes with that investment is greater immiseration for the mass of the people, actually fewer jobs, less access to the land, and more oppression. As that becomes evident, so the media then must tirelessly paint a negative picture of socialist societies. Anti-Sovietism is also very important to justify the massive escalation in military spending. Since he's been in office, Ronald Reagan has spent $2 trillion on military spending. That's more than all the other presidents put together. Since Ronald Reagan has been in office, he's been the wildest, wild-eyed, craziest, wildest, maddest spender in the history of our country. The national debt, which was $900 billion when he came into office, and the largest peacetime debt ever rolled up, I think, was Jimmy Carter's $60 billion one year, maybe $80 billion the other year. Every year he has produced budget deficits. Did I say debt? I mean the largest deficit. Deficit is your yearly, in the red, deficit. The debt is the accumulation of all those deficits. $900 billion national debt. When Ronald Reagan leaves office, it will be $2,700 billion, or $2.7 trillion. He will have tripled the national debt. He will have added more to the national debt than all the other presidents in the history of the United States put together, peacetime and wartime. Jimmy Carter's biggest debt of $80 billion is less than half of Ronald Reagan's smallest debt of $170 billion. This year's deficit, this year's deficit is, Reagan's deficit this year is $220 billion, a record. We're going off the charts. And if you draw these deficits, you know, of the presidents, different presidents, and you draw them, I wish I had a blackboard, you'd see FDR, he fought World War II, there was a lot of deficit spending, Truman, and then you get to Eisenhower, small, and it goes like that, and Ford and Nixon, suddenly bigger, Carter, and then you get Reagan's, and it goes off the chart. It will just go off the chart. You would need a special kind of paper to put it on. And they call him the Teflon president. He's not the Teflon president. They let him get away with all that because he treats them good. Because that debt was piled up from two sources. One, the massive escalation in military spending, and two, the massive tax cuts to the rich and to the big corporations in this country, with little cuts to the little guys. He gave little things to the little people and big favors to the big people. And that's where the debt comes. So how does he finance it all? We now see how he's able to do it. And through all that time, he cut from human services $140 billion he has cut from human services. That $140 billion will keep the Pentagon going for less than 4 months today, what the Pentagon is now spending every year. And that was cut. The hundreds of millions of dollars cut from the Women's, Infants, and Children program, from the supplementary social income program, which was for the most desperate people in our society, the disabled, the aged, the blind, the deaf. The WIC program, Women's, Infant, Children, was for those people, those kids who were starving, who couldn't even qualify for welfare or food stamps or weren't getting anything. It was like emergency aid. And he's cutting that stuff, and he cuts peanuts. And when you look at what he saved a few $100 million, enough to buy a few more tanks. That's what he's gotten out of that. And all that cutting, all that attack on human services doesn't amount to peanuts compared to what you spend on the military. Because human services amount to tens of millions and hundreds of millions, whereas the military is hundreds of billions. And that's the difference. Well, to justify that kind of spending, you've got to have an enemy out there. To justify the kind of spending that can give Winfred Rockefeller, owner of McDonnell Aircraft, a 30-40% profit with guaranteed cost overruns with non-competitive bids on the contracts, to justify 2 pairs of pliers that the Pentagon buys that cost $2,700 and change. I don't remember exact price. $2,700 for 2 pairs of pliers the Pentagon bought last year. Did you see that item in the Washington Post? But the tough, hard-nosed Pentagon bargainers got it down to $1,400, a real steal. To justify that kind of thing, you've got to have a real enemy out there, and a big enemy, big bad bear enemy. And the one thing you don't want to do then is go out there and negotiate and reduce your armaments with him. What do? How do you come back to your people and say, okay, next year we've got to spend $400 billion? That's what Cap Weinberger is trying to do. He's saying, if we get rid of our nuclear weapons, then we'll have to double and triple our conventional forces because they're so much greater and more powerful in conventional forces than we are. Another lie which the media is dutifully, uncritically repeating again and again. In fact, and my source would be General Nino Pasti, a NATO general. Pasti, you know, who used to be in and out of the Pentagon here, who now can't get a visa to come here because he had a change of heart. He's retired. He's become a senator in the Italian Senate, independent senator. Wrote a book on Euro missiles and points out that, in fact, in conventional forces, the NATO forces are as effective, if not better, than the Warsaw forces. That in some weapons, like tanks and some other conventional artillery weapons, they've got more than we have. But in other weapons, like land missiles and striking power and whatever else, we are superior in terms of the NATO forces are superior in terms of being able to defend, and even in actual numbers. Yet again and again, it's reported that these conventional forces would be a threat, making people anxious about getting rid of their nuclear weapons. What would disarmament and peace do to our economy? What would that do to the process of capital demand and capital investment formation, which is the main function of the military-industrial complex? What would that do to profits and capital accumulation? So you've got to have out there that big menace. You also have to have that menace because you have to make the world safe for hypocrisy. You have to make the world safe for multinational corporate investment in places like Central America. And how can you convince the American people that you're in Central America to make the world safe for Exxon and ITT and Chase Manhattan? So you say you're there to fight, to defend national security. But how do you convince them that a tiny country like El Salvador or Nicaragua is a threat to our national security? The image of the Sandinista 50,000-person army cutting a swath up through Guatemala, Mexico, through the heartland of the U.S. and coming right here to Amherst and dancing with your sister. The image strains one's credulity. Walter Lippmann used to talk about that. Was a real argument during the Vietnam War. We have to fight them. We heard it again and again. We have to fight them in the jungles of Vietnam, or we'll be fighting them on the beaches of California. And Walter Lippmann said, the image of the Vietnamese getting into their little PT boats and coming all the way across the Pacific and invading California was an insult to the U.S. Navy, he said. Which was, I mean, after all, you did have the Sixth Fleet sitting there. Well, you can justify intervention in Nicaragua by saying, or El Salvador, you can say, those guerrillas are the Salvadoran guerrillas are the puppets of the Nicaraguans, who are the puppets of the Cubans, who are the puppets of the Kremlin. Bum, bum, bum. And that's how you get intervention going. And you don't report the fact that the Soviets have signed a no-first-use pledge on nuclear weapons, or you downplay it. You don't report the fact that the Soviets unilaterally offered to cut their conventional forces, Warsaw forces, mutual cuts with Warsaw and NATO forces with the eventual elimination of both military pacts. That's an offer they've put on the table a number of times, which has just not been considered, taken seriously. Because what happens, what does a president do when the communists keep threatening him with friendly overtures? What does he do? Well, what the real Ronald Reagan, and the two faces of Reagan, the real Ronald Reagan did what he had been doing for 20 years when he came into office. He said, we will not negotiate with the Russians. I'm against any negotiation with them. You don't negotiate with those people. Because there's not trickery and manipulation and danger, and what you do with the devil is you just strengthen your defenses, because that's the only thing you understand. That was the real Ronald Reagan, and that blew up in his face, because in 81, 82, and 83 you saw a massive nuclear freeze movement, a massive peace movement emerging, and they got to him and said, Ronnie, we got to try something else. You got to give the appearance that you're interested in peace. So he said, so stage 2 was, we'll negotiate. About 83 to October of 84, we'll negotiate, but don't put too much into it. It's going to take a long process, and it's not going to amount to anything, and don't get your hopes up. That was the position. And that wasn't very satisfying. And then in October of 84, very significant date, well, what happens in November of 84? In October of 84, Reagan came out and said, I will go to Geneva and search for world peace and try to get an arms agreement and all that sort of thing. I went to Reykjavik, and he comes out pretending he's angry and this and that, showing he sincerely tried to get an arms agreement, knowing full well that the Soviets would never agree to a cut in all their deterrence weapons while he's building Star Wars over their heads, right over their heads, and refusing to negotiate or put Star Wars on the table. While they put their ICBMs on the table, they put their intermediate range missiles on the table, they put about everything. It looks like Gorbachev was ready to give away the store on some of those. In fact, American negotiators said we were caught breathless by the scope and range of his offers and his concessions. He was accepting Reagan's zero sum. He was accepting any number of other things. But as I say, that creates problems when the other side is ready to say yes. Now, there's an element of hope in all this, and that element of hope is just what I just referred to before. Despite the years and decades of propaganda, despite the fact that the communist is in the popular imagery of our mind, a menace and all that sort of thing, that kind of propaganda doesn't always translate into indoctrination. That people still want peace, people still think that there can be changes. Overwhelming majorities, the American people in all the opinion polls say there can be a negotiated settlement. Overwhelming majorities want a nuclear freeze and think one can be effected. By 4-to-1, 5-to-1 majorities, they are against U.S. involvement in Central America. They are for, by 60% or so, they are for military cuts, and they have always, every opinion poll since the 50s have always shown them against military cuts, except for that one period during the Iranian hostage period and the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. Then they suddenly were for increased military spending. But except for that maybe less than a year period, the opinion polls have shown that. So who do our leaders represent? They represent those who benefit so well from the existing arrangements of militarism, interventionism, and Cold War confrontation. Communism may be a fear word, eliciting without benefit or explanation or definition a negative response from many people, and yet, when communists come here, we find Americans are when Khrushchev came to this country, the American people greeted him, were very appreciative that he visited and wanted to see America, and treated him in a far more friendly way than the media did. I have even a little section, Inventing Reality, on that called Nikita Conquers America, which you might want to look at to see that dynamic. A poll was taken a few years ago, and by the way, the results of this poll were largely repressed. Very few of the syndicated services that usually carry this was a Harris poll, very few of them carried this one. A poll was taken and said, of the above countries, and it listed about 25 key countries, and said, of the above countries, which of these would you be willing to commit American troops if they were the object of armed communist invasion? I mean, very inflammatorily phrased. And by overwhelming, stunning majorities, the American people said none of them. They wouldn't send American troops except one. Do you know what country they would willing to commit troops to? No, not the U.S. No, other countries, not the U.S. Canada, which of course isn't really another country. I mean, it's practically. Oh, I'm sorry, if there's any Canadians here. I was only joking here to our cousins from the north, who have to put up a lot with living close to the American Colossus. So even as nervous left liberal intellectuals flash their anti-Soviet credentials, even as nervous Marxicologists flash their anti-Soviet credentials, Even as nervous critics of U.S. foreign policy flashed their anti-Soviet credentials, the American people were interested in a less anti-Soviet attitude and in trying to reach some kind of agreement and peace with that country, which today has unilaterally stopped all nuclear testing for 18 months now, hasn't it been? Or 15 months or so. And so what I'm saying is that we may have more power than we think. If you recall, Ronald Reagan has not invaded Nicaragua. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing. If you recall, he was obliged to go to Geneva. That was an extraordinary thing. I said before Reykjavik, I said he has no intentions of reaching any serious arms agreement. But when he goes to Geneva, he's putting the lie to his own propaganda, which is that you can't negotiate with them, that there's really no interest in doing it, that they're demons, that they're an evil empire. When the Soviet leader comes forward and says, let's negotiate, let's try again, let's do that, that diffuses the anti-Soviet hysteria. And you can see it when you talk to audiences, where the year before you would talk and they'd be snarling, what about the Russians, what about the Russians, the Russians, the Russians, the Russians, the Russians? And suddenly it's calmed down. And people are listening and saying, yeah, maybe there is grounds of negotiation. The president himself thinks there's grounds for negotiation and an agreement, then maybe they ain't so menacing and bad. He had to pay that political price, even though he never got the substantive agreement. So they have to make concessions. Why did he do that? He did that to try to defuse the peace forces in this country. But in trying to defuse them, he had to make concessions to them, which means that they have a certain strength. And he hasn't invaded Nicaragua even though he wants to and is dying to. And the U.S. has invaded Nicaragua 11 times since 1888. And when Calvin Coolidge went in there in 1928 and killed Sandino and murdered people and whatever else, Coleman McCarthy had a column on that. He interviewed a 78-year-old U.S. Marine who talked about what he did then, how they emasculated men and cut their genitals off, how they tortured prisoners, how he himself shot a couple of people standing in line for this phony election in 1928, and how he had nightmares after it. He was a young kid. He was 18 years old, whatever, at the time. And today you have a president who has a firepower that's 1,000 times more powerful than anything Calvin Coolidge had, in mobility, a striking force that's 1,000 times more deadly, and who's 1,000 times crazier and drooling to attack Nicaragua, and yet he doesn't. And why doesn't he? Because it would be too costly. Because it would cost thousands of American lives. And he's unsure about what world opinion and what U.S. opinion would do, and what members of his own party would say, hey, we got to run for re-election. Don't do that, will you? That's too costly. Too costly? Not too costly for him. He would sacrifice 10,000 of you any day if he could knock off Nicaragua and call it a victory. He had 261 Marines blown away on one morning in Lebanon, and all he wanted to do was jump back in there and keep fighting. That wasn't too costly to him. What's 261? He can get more where that came from. It was politically too costly. It was people in his own party saying, get the hell out of Lebanon, will you? We got an election coming up. What are you doing? Get out of there. It's a no-win situation. We're going to get ourselves into something bad. It's too politically costly. It's causing even the media to raise an arch eye and say, is this policy really the thing that is most effective right now for U.S. interests in that part of the world? So, what I say to you, ladies and gentlemen, is don't mourn, but organize. Organize, educate, agitate. And when you use anti-Sovietism to gain your credibility, you ain't gaining any credibility, because whether you have a dissident view of the Soviet Union or a Ronald Reagan view of the Soviet Union or whatever else, if you want to sound like him on that issue, the point of the matter is, when you play with that anti-Sovietism, it doesn't mean you can't be critical if there are things you critically dislike and don't like. But I'm talking about this kind of propaganda turnout that we've had all along. When you do that to gain your credibility, you're playing right into Ronald Reagan's hands, and you don't gain any credibility. They'll still come after you if you're a reformist or you want progressive change. Just on the basis of that, they're against that. The only way to maintain your credibility is to speak the truth forthrightly, honestly, openly, strongly. Thank you.
Okay, next we're going to have a question and answer session. There's a microphone right there in the middle. You can see there's a line already forming.
After they've gone through repeated procedures over 40 different steps, which take years to accomplish.
I guess the answer there is that when I was in the Soviet Union, that large synagogue was open, and there were people worshiping in it. It wasn't closed down. There's a rabbinical school in Moscow which trains rabbis. I mean, I didn't see the school. I saw photos of it, and I saw the names of the head rabbis. It was all in Soviet life. Louis Moroz has written books about this. I think there has been harassment of people who want to go to Israel because of the threat that people who leave the country is a loss of resource for them. They don't want to see happen to them what's happened in a lot of countries, which is a very serious problem. It's called brain drain. And once you allow people to leave, by the way, under the guise of religious freedom, most of the Soviet Jews who come here are not religious. I would really have to take serious exception with you. At least the studies I've seen of the Brighton Beach populations, a thing that was published by Patricia Howell in these times, and all very favorable toward the people, but said they were not religious. They wanted to come because they didn't like life there, and they felt they could have better opportunities here, which is the traditional reason why people want to emigrate. This does not represent the entire Jewish population. There are over 2 million Jews in the Soviet Union, and 250,000 have left, and they maintain that maybe there's another 15,000 with outstanding applications, and some are denied visas because of criminal records, black marketeering, something like that, or other problems. Or the odd thing in the Soviet Union, you can't emigrate unless you get your parents' permission. This has something to do with maintaining the integrity of the family. So that could be a problem also in some cases. Jews who are less than 2% of the Soviet population really occupy upwards of 20% of the elite positions in the party, in the government, in the sciences, more like 30 or 40% in physics and in mathematics. With tremendous accomplishments. So you can't really say that they are suffering under in the military. There are about 40 Jewish generals, one of whom was just denied a visa to visit the U.S., wasn't it, last year? He's a Russian Jew. Jews do not have to have stamped on their passport Jew. You choose your nationality. You just have a nationality. It's when you go into the army, or when you reach a certain age, you're going to school or the university, you pick your nationality, and you can pick any nationality you want. And I talked to a guy when I was there. He was Jewish, his wife was Russian, and his 2 kids were growing up. He said he hoped his kids picked to be Jewish. They could pick being Russian or Jewish. They could pick to be Georgian or Azerbaijani if they want. It wouldn't make much sense because, you know, they didn't speak Georgian or Azerbaijani. But let's say if they moved to the Ukraine, the kids could have chosen to pick neither Jew nor Russian, and they could have on their nationality Ukrainian if they wanted to. So I do not believe, contrary to what I've been hearing, and I was very surprised to hear this recently, that there is this kind of all-permeating oppression of Jews. There's anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union as a popular attitude. You can find it in Ukraine and Belarus. A friend of mine who was there ran into it with a Soviet taxi driver, and then he ran into it with a party member. It's Dan Totis, who teaches at Johns Hopkins, and said to the guy, "Hey, you know, I'm Jewish." And the guy said, "Oh, look, I'm sorry. Oh, I don't know." Got very nervous because he could be kicked out of the party for uttering an anti-Semitic remark. So there are anti-Semitic strains and attitudes. There's no denying that. And there may be real incidents also. And there may be at times problems. But I don't see it as an anti-Semitic society the way Nazi Germany was, and to equate it that way when Jews are in prominent positions all through the society, in the arts, in the sciences, in government, in the military, and everywhere, is really a very jaundiced and one-sided view. But they're not going to let certain Jews out. They're not going to let people out who are nuclear physicists. They just ain't going to let those people out. The other view is that there's not 17,000 more Jews who want to leave, that there's more like 300,000. That's the claim that's being made now by Jewish groups who send letters and say that we're their relatives. You see, but emigration is like a hemorrhaging. You let this person out, that person wants their family comes, the daughter wants her parents, the parents come and they want their other kids to join them. I mean, there's a constant hemorrhaging, and so there will always be in any emigration, there's going to be some kind of cutoff point in that way. Next questioner, please.
Thank you. Earlier this year on Crossfire, the asked you were.
By the way, can I also add, I met Soviet Jews who did not feel that they were living in... One of our guides was a woman named Iskra who was Jewish, and she said, I don't know what you're talking about in terms of anti-Semitism. One of the bus drivers we had was a guy who was a Jew, and we asked him, you run into, and they said, do you feel the government is anti-Semitic? Do you feel discriminated against? He says, no, not at all, no. And I said, why do people want to leave? He said, there's always some people who want to leave, then let them leave, you know. And that was his attitude. Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
You were on Crossfire with Reed Irvine.
Yes, I was on Crossfire with Reed Irvine. Why did you have to remind me?
And he asked you if you were a Marxist, and you said yes, and then no. Are you a Marxist, or are you not?
I said, and this is my answer, I would wear that label proudly if I knew that you understood what I meant by Marxist. And when somebody like Reed Irvine says, you're a Marxist, aren't you, whose only intention is to give a buzzword which says this guy drinks the blood of capitalist children or something, then I'm going to say, no, I'm not your label. I don't particularly want your label. That was why I deferred from the label Marxist. And you see, there's something about saying Marxist when I write a book about the media, and you remember the point I made, I said, look, I wrote the book about the media. I don't know what Karl Marx has to say about 20th century U.S. media. I think he had very little to say because, you know, he left early. But there's been a lot of creative thought and scholarship in Marxist literature and whatever else, and I feel that it's like a scholasticist thing. Oh, you took your formula and you applied it here. I don't see these things that way because I'm a Marxist. Just the opposite. I started seeing these things and then I began realizing that there was an analysis that had explanatory power for that. It gets very frustrating. You know, for years I'd knock myself out trying to make an analysis. I'd come to the conclusion, I'd say, hey, you know, the police are not neutral. They're on the side of property and power. And somebody would say to me, that's a Marxist. You know, you sound like a Marxist. I said, Marxist? Oh. And then I said, hey, you know, wealth is largely unaccountable in many of the things it does in our democracy. I don't understand. That isn't what I learned. So that's a Marxist point of view. That's Marx said that, you know. And it would go on, one thing after another. Every time I said, boy, this Karl Marx was really something, you know. Every time I put two and two together and come up with a good analysis, they give him the credit for it. Yeah.
And just one more thing. You said Cuba was so great. Is it great for the homosexuals?
I didn't say Cuba was so great. I said that it was a very real improvement over what it had before, and that in some ways, comparing it even to a rich Western industrial capitalist society, it came off better, like in the area like healthcare. As far as homosexuals, the attitude in Cuba, I think people got it wrong. Here I'll quote Saul Landau, who knows probably more about Cuba than any other American I know. His argument is that the oppression of homosexuals is not something the Communist Party does, that if there wasn't the thin red line of the Communist Party in Cuba, most of those homosexuals would have had their brains beaten out. That the gay phobia, the homophobia, and the anti-gay attitudes are part of the Latino Cubano population, and that in fact there has been an attempt to change that, and the feeling is very strong about the maricón, you know, all that sort of thing. And I was in Cuba. My only contact with gays was I walked along the street one day and met a gay guy who was obviously cruising and tried to hit on me, and I talked to him while I said goodbye, no thanks. And the other, but he was pretty upfront. He wasn't looking over his shoulder and saying, don't tell anybody, compañero, will you? Although it was rather late at night anyway. But the other contact was at the ballet, the Alicia Alonso, you know, the National Ballet of Cuba. Half the audience were upfront gays. I mean, it was pretty evident half the audience were upfront gays. They were there. There is a gay community in Havana, a very real one. I think, though, gay life is restricted. It doesn't have the kind of cultural freedom that you have here. You can't, for instance, write gay novels and expect to get them published. So there's still that restriction. The old restrictions against gays working in certain occupations, specifically working in teaching, under the old prejudice that the gay in the school will start trying to molest the little kids and all that, that's been eliminated. Today, nobody is denied any job in any occupational area because of sexual preference in Cuba. But there still is work to be done there. And I would say there are real criticisms you can make about that situation. But it's improved over the last 20 years.
You have implied here tonight, you have said in the past that the average Soviet worker is better off than the average American worker.
In certain respects, depending on how you measure it.
And now, my first question is, first of all, do you support the Solidarity labor movement in Poland?
The Solidarity labor movement in Poland doesn't exist anymore. It's been broken. I supported the very real and legitimate complaints that Solidarity made in Poland, which was that there was a Polish government that was corrupt, that it had drastically mismanaged things, that they'd gotten itself into a national debt which now called for cutback. Here's what the Polish government did. They said, we want to have major capitalization and industrialize. But we also want an increase in consumer goods and consumption. Now, how do you do both those things? How do you use your capital for capitalization and use it also for consumption, increasing consumption? Oh, they found a way. There were Western banks who would lend them the money. And somebody forgot to sit down with his calculator and see what does $1 million do at a certain percent interest over a certain number of years. You know what it does? It grows and grows and grows and grows. And suddenly when those notes came due, the Polish government turned around and said, oh, we goofed. In order to pay these notes, they have to do what all countries had to do under the IMF and the World Bank. Well, IMF, really. What the IMF does when the bucks are out there and you're not paying it, they introduce what's called a stabilization program, which means, very simply, you've got to cut back on consumption. Consume less for your workers, less social service, less that, so you have more money and more, give them less, more to export, more to earn, more to pay back our debt. So the government turned around to the workers right around Christmas time too and said, sorry, we're going to have to put a freeze on this, put a freeze on that, cut back on that, cut back on meat consumption, so forth and so on. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And the workers went out with a whole array of very real grievances. I also supported them in the subsequent months when the government did what often many vested governments do, or your average college dean, stall, not agree to the agreements and then not carry some of them out and all that sort of thing. I did not agree with Solidarity when Lech Wałęsa, who was after all a close associate of Jack Kurin of CORE, who himself is a right-winger, a close associate of Milczewski, who was head of the Confederation for an Independent Poland, who was an open fascist sympathizer, when Lech Wałęsa got up and said, and who, by the way, is an open admirer of Ronald Reagan. The Harvard International Review has an interview with him and say, what do you think? And Lech Wałęsa volunteers, Ronald Reagan is a great president. When he said we will be moving towards state power, I didn't support that move because I believe that the Solidarity leadership was anti-socialist, right-wing. I believe the kind of anarcho-syndical worker ownership they had about the factories was so half-baked that the economy would have been totally wrecked. They had no plans as to how that system would work. How would you get the steel to the shipyards? What if a factory decided to move into a new line? What do you do about the fact that some factories are far more productive than others? What do you do about social services? How do you reallocate the surplus value so that you can have services for people who can't work? All those questions were never dealt with by Solidarity, so that's my criticism of Solidarity. Yeah.
You mentioned East Germany. why did they build a wall around their country to prevent their people from leaving? And why during the building of that wall did they shoot their own citizens?
Well, you see, just drop that kind of loaded vocabulary of workers' paradise, and let's get back to your original statement about, you said that the Soviet worker has it so much better than the American worker. In certain aspects, I said in terms of job security, pension, retirement, protections against inflation, that sort of thing. If you want to measure it in terms of numbers of colored television sets, even television sets now, 97% or whatever, very high, 90-something% of the people all have television sets. The only areas are certain remote parts of the country, there's no television yet. But everybody's got television sets, so big deal. East Germany, there's several things that happen there. Again, it's a question of brain drain. Again, don't forget that during World War II, it was the eastern part of Germany that got the bulk of the Allied bombing. So when the partition came, East Germany was a much more severely damaged area than West Germany. Don't forget also that the Soviets then made a strategic mistake. They started looking for reparations, and they stripped some of the heavy machinery from East Germany, whereas the West started pouring billions of dollars into West Germany. So there was a tremendous consumer prosperity in West Germany. Don't forget also that a good portion of the population in East Germany were Nazis and Hitler sympathizers, a good 20% of the people. And they wanted to get the hell out, and things were not good for them. And one of the first things the East German governments did was get rid of 80% of the teachers who had taught under Nazi Germany and collaborated with Nazi Germany. Got rid of a lot of the judges. Got rid of a lot. Well, those people and their families wanted to get west, where they could have a more comfortable time. And then again, there's that hemorrhaging and brain drain, which the East Germans were not inclined to tolerate. And so they sealed their border, because that kind of migration would have seriously interfered with their economic development. Today, East Germany is about the 6th or 7th most powerful industrial country in the world. It's only got 18 million people in it, and very prosperous. And very prosperous. All right, can we go on to the next person? I think you asked me a couple of questions that you see. You asked me a couple of questions which really require very complicated and protracted answers, given the abyss of information, the dearth of information in our country about these things. What we have is a few things. Oh, the East Germans wanted to jump across the wall. They weren't free. What do you think about that? Well, it's time we start thinking about that and getting some information as to what were the things behind that. And I just gave you what was my answer. And there are other people online. Yes?
Hi. I wanted to say I really enjoyed this speech. I'm really glad you came. And that's actually what my question was going to be. Could you recommend any literature, books, periodicals, or anything where we could find more balanced kind of information about these kinds of things?
You could read Al Szymanski's book, Is the Red Flag Flying? Szymanski is spelled S-Z-Y-M-A-N-S-K-I or Y. I think it's a Y. Another book he wrote called Human Rights in the Soviet Union. You might want to look at Mike David Dow's book called Cities Without Crises, which is about urban affairs, although David Dow does gush now and then. There's still interesting information in there you can glean from that. Even the more standard Sovietologists who are critical, like Alex Novi or Sam Hindell, read them. They're still better than the U.S. media because they'll give you a lot of the hard information. Szymanski based most of his stuff on American Sovietologists. He says, of course, they have the ideological anti-Sovietism and all that, but they do provide very interesting information. So you could maybe start with those people. Louis Morose and Progress Publishers has a number of books on Jews in the Soviet Union, which you might want to look at as an alternative. Just look at it, get a copy. You can then poo-poo it and throw it against the wall, but just take a look at that. And I don't know, there isn't any one really single volume, I think, that treats all this. Someday I'll write it. Yeah. I'm serious, I'm keeping a file on all this. Periodicals, People's Daily World occasionally have a story, political affairs. there are the other ones that come. What anybody know the new masses, or what's that one? No, New World Affairs, or I can't remember now. Soviet Life. There's a publication you might want to look at. Soviet Life is by the way, very beautiful layout too. You might want to look at that. If you want to get a different impression, as you begin to see they're real, like human beings living there and doing things and all that sort of thing. You might want to look at that. Okay. Yeah.
You seem to support the Soviet welfare state and its virtues, and then you come off and you say that our national debt is caused by our military, our defense spending. But how come you're so ignorant of the past 20 years of the rise of bureaucracy and the welfare state in America, which is really primarily the cause of our yearly deficit and our national debt?
Well, well, I'm glad you're helping me in my ignorance, but my reading of the figures is that if you look at the budget, the payments for welfare are, if you eliminated all those payments, you would eliminate about 5% of your budget. So how could that explain the deficit of 220 billion? Welfare payments come to about $7 billion for aid to families with dependent children. In fact, it's been cut, and it's very insufficient for what exists. But if you look at that, the two largest items in our budget are military spending and the $150 billion a year now that has to come out to service the national debt. By the way, what is a national debt? It's money which the government owes. That means us, future taxpayers. That's how Reagan has floated this whole thing. He's taxing the future. He's taxing your future. It's money the government owes to financial houses, rich creditors, and banks when they buy up all these treasury bonds. And then the government has money to go on spending. And as Karl Marx said in Capital, Volume 1, of all the commonwealth that is supposedly belongs to the people, the one thing they definitely own is the national debt. And you're going to be paying that for years ahead. Well, $150 billion off the top, $300 billion for military spending, that's $450 billion. That's most of our budget there. So how could you tell me the deficit is being caused by welfare spending? The figures just don't seem to support that position. Maybe you should look at the figures before you go around calling people ignorant. Okay, let's have the next question. Let's have the next question.
Dr. Parenti, the ABC television has planned a 12-hour TV special called America, which you may well have heard of, scheduled for February, which is a view of the United States 10 years after Soviet takeover.
Right, Soviets. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could perhaps comment on that plan going, and what kind of strategy you might recommend for countering some of the propaganda potential of that.
Well, you know, a very interesting development. I'll take the second question first. The Washington Post now comes out with a Washington Post magazine every Sunday. And the first couple of Sundays, it was kind of racist. I mean, it was crappy. There were things in there that did not sit right about black youth who go into stores and all that, the problem of shoplifting, when in fact, by the way, all the statistics show, even in Washington, that shoplifters cut across the complexion spectrum and the income spectrum. And some shoplifters come from Georgetown, wherever else, and they have a problem with all sorts of people. But these kind of things, what the people started doing, you know, black people, they organized a throwback, it was called, I think. And every Sunday they take their copy of the Washington magazine, they go down to the Washington Post, and they heave them into the front door of the Washington Post, big piles of them. And they started off with 70 people, and now it's up to about 350, and these things are piling in there. And Ben Bradley is kind of kicking them away, and it's changed the Post, and it's gotten some publicity, by the way. So maybe what we have to do is call back. I always say, call back, talk back, call into ABC, complain, write letters, say, what is this kind of crap? What are you doing? What is that supposed to accomplish? What kind of cheap, rotten sensationalism? As for the content of the program itself, I've seen it. It hasn't been shown yet, but I've seen it. It's called Red Dawn. It's called Invasion USA. It's called Rambo 4, 2, 3. I watched Red Dawn, I watched Invasion USA, and you see these Russians, Cubans. Invasion USA was interesting, kind of Arab, Cuban, Russians, a whole mixture of these guys, Gaddafi, Libyans, and they were ha ha ha, and they were coming in, shooting people, turning the people against the police, and they were taking over the country. And nobody but Chuck Norris understood the situation. The State Department couldn't quite grasp it, the Pentagon couldn't quite know what was up, and Chuck Norris got up there with his 2 machine guns, and he went, bada, 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 and he got a few vigilantes, and they started the confrontation right about the edge of Washington. Near my neighborhood, they stopped them. I was relieved, you know. Well, what we have is very simply the fact that the line between entertainment media and news media is blurring, just as the line in their heads is blurred between fantasy and reality. So they're trying to blur it for us, and so you get these kinds of pictures. That is part of a basic paradigm which has permeated the media for years. You can see it in the jungle movies, you can see it in the cowboy movies, you can see it in the science fiction movies. It is the paradigm, the model of the wagon circle. The wagon's circle, the fort, the camp, the city embattled by the aliens from outside. Here, inside this wagon, are discernible human beings, warm life, mothers chucking their little ones under the chin, putting them to bed. Outside the periphery of the wagon circle are the screaming savages, who, for reasons not understood by anybody, are driven by one thing, which is a bloodlusting, to kill the human beings who are inside the camp, the city. The aliens from outer space, they can take all sorts of forms. In Invasion of the Body Snatchers, they came as pods, as vegetations that came into people's nostrils and turned them into zombies. What a movie. I cursed the person who dragged me there, and I had to sit through it because she had the car. They had the car. There was a couple of them. You outvoted, so you sit through the thing. Or it could be Godzilla emerging from the ocean to impose his urban renewal project on downtown Tokyo, you know. But in any case, there's this monster who just wants to come and kill and tear and attack us. These screeching savages, red, brown, black, different races, who are not there, they're not defending their land, they're not defending their herds or their food supply or anything like that, their families, their tribes. They're just there because they're hell-bent on attacking us. There's an evil empire out there, and all it wants to do is expand and attack. It's a model which then, by the way, it's one thing, you know, and you run into students, and then, by the way, that's transposed into explicitly political movies like Red Dawn, Invasion USA, White Knights. A student of mine last year was teaching at Brooklyn College, and he said, well, if that's true and you think we can negotiate, how come in this movie with Baryshnikov, right, White Knights, the guy said this and this, and the other guy said that, and then the Soviet guys tried to entrap them? I said, well, maybe it's not like it was in that movie. Maybe real life is different. One of the advantages of coming to college is you don't have to rely on Hollywood anymore for all your data, you know? Now, it's one thing when a student believes it, but when the President of the United States believes it, when he comes out of Rambo 4 and says, now I know how to handle the Sandinistas. A joke, you know, like, war's been declared, we bomb Russia in 5 minutes. Joke, you know. My grandmother used to say, you know when a man for sure is telling the truth 3 times. One, when he speaks when he's drunk, when he's angry, or when he's joking. And then I always thought of Ronald Reagan, always thought of Grandma. When that was said. Well, that's the paradigm that supports U.S. foreign policy in that sense. I mean that there's this evil empire that inexorably wants to expand. It's very functional, and that's why ABC is putting that movie on. And we should tell them to stop trashing our minds. Thank you. Let's get to the next person. This is going to be a hot one.
Okay, my name is Hammer from Germany, so I apologize for my accent. Maybe not proper speaking this language.
Oh, don't apologize. Look, you speak English a lot better than most of us speak German, so that's okay.
Thank you very much. First of all, I appreciate your concern about the things that go wrong in this society, and that there's really a desire to work on that and work for the improvement. One thing, however, that kind of confuses me tonight is the way where you're comparing things. You're taking America, comparing it to something which is entirely good, and saying America is bad because it cannot keep up with this standard. Then, you're taking the Soviet system, comparing it to something which would entirely not work. They're saying, oh well, they're working, it's going well. Throughout all the time, you're avoiding direct comparison. The importance of direct comparison is not to lead away from our own problems, but in order to find out if the other way is actually a better way of going.
I see. Well, I think it's a very good criticism if that was happening, if in fact I was being very selective in my data and taking the worst aspects of American society and comparing them to imaginary things in the Soviet Union. But I thought I was making direct comparisons just as you wanted. I was comparing the condition of labor in this country to conditions there in terms of job security and wages, that sort of thing. I was comparing the willingness to negotiate here with the willingness to negotiate there. Look, you don't have to like that society, okay? You don't have to like it. What gets to be a problem is when you get people like E.P. Thompson and others who say, we can never have peace until we also have freedom in their country, and therefore every dissident must be free to say whatever he wants, and they should change their social order in any way we dictate, and until we do that, we can't get an arms negotiation. Well, that's a new position in the history of world diplomacy. A sovereign state goes forward, and by the way, that was affected at Reykjavik. That's exactly what Reagan does. The closer they get to arms agreement, the more he then moves to say, what about Afghanistan, and what about human rights in your society, and what about this? Where do you get off dictating to another leader? Why Gorbachev could turn around and say, I'm not going to have an agreement with you until you take care of the homeless, or until you stop oppressing the American Indians, or the blacks in Mississippi, or Chicago, or wherever else. Or what about this or that? Or what about the racism in your society? You can go on with what's wrong in various societies or what you think is wrong in each society. The question I'm saying is, you don't have to like the Soviet Union, and you can keep your image of it, but just don't blow up the world that I live in and my children live in because you got such a grudge against them, okay? Just don't blow up 240 million Soviet citizens because you don't like the policies of their leaders and whatever else. You talk to Soviet citizens, they seem to like their leaders. And not all of them. I don't know any country you can go to where you can find everybody who likes everything and everything their leaders do. So that's all I'm saying. I don't really think I can say anything more about internal Soviet society. I do think, though, it's a blatant distortion when you say they're riddled with inflation when there ain't inflation. And I don't think it's unreasonable to point that out. I think it's a blatant distortion to say that they can't feed their people when they do feed their people, when it's one of the few, when you've got a country here where we don't feed hundreds of thousands, millions of people, where the Citizens Committee on Hunger and Malnutrition has come out and said malnutrition and hunger is back in the USA. You can go into neighborhoods in Detroit, in Mississippi, in Indiana. When I lived in Illinois, you can go to Carbondale, Illinois, in the richest farmland in the world, and you'll see kids, white kids, hungry, got nothing all week. What'd they have all week? Kool-Aid.
Right here in Amherst, too.
You can see it in Amherst, I guess. And then that's all. The fastest social growing group in the United States are the poor. Since Reagan has come into office, they've gone from 24 million below the poverty level to 35 million. I don't think that's a selective or unfair comparison. And I don't think everything in America is bad. I think the struggles and the freedoms that we have fought for and have tried to maintain, which allow us to talk right here now without the goon squads coming in, as they would have done 100 years ago in this country if you had this kind of conversation. The constable probably would have locked that door, or the president of the university would have thrown us all out and not allowed the speech to go on. I think those are freedoms which we have won. And that's not something my country gave me. There's some mystical entity called my country that gave me those freedoms. Those freedoms were won through democratic struggle, through agitation, through demonstration, through the right to have the vote. Women were never given the vote. Women had to fight for 100 years and demonstrate, get garbage thrown at them and spit on and arrested and thrown into jail. Some of them died of pneumonia, force-fed in prison. They fought, they had to forcibly extract that democratic right. And labor was never given the right to collective bargaining, and working people were never given the right to vote. They had to fight for it and extract. And I think those things are terrific. And that's a part of America that we don't know enough about, that great democratic struggle. And that's got to go on and continue and advance. So I don't have a totally negative view toward America. I have a totally negative view toward America only if you confuse America with Ronald Reagan, as he tries to do. Let me go on to the next person. There's a long line. I think we have to stop anyway.
Can we just say that nobody else?
Just wait a second.
We'll just ask that nobody else join
What's
the
this?
line. Okay, nobody else.
I got lunch. Excuse me. What is, yeah.
You can eat if you want to.
What is it?
It's chocolate chip cookies.
I can't eat that now. What is this?
Orange juice.
Oh, good. Why don't we just take... I know, I'm sorry. I hate to push you on, but there's a long line. Why don't we just take a couple more questions? Could I ask people to just sit down, because it's now 9. Go ahead. Why don't you make one more statement, since you seem determined not to leave?
You were saying that when Gorbachev went into Geneva, that his intentions were entirely good, that he just wanted peace, he just wanted to get away with all the problems, while Ronald Reagan was entirely evil motivated. What gives you the right to make this claim, just looking at their actions? Actions speak much clearer than words do.
Right. And Gorbachev unilaterally has instituted a moratorium on nuclear weapons. Yeah, well, please finish and have some regard for people behind you in the hour, that's all. Sorry, I didn't mean to get...
We know that America threatened Nicaragua. We also know that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. So how can you say that the Soviet Union is well motivated, the American president is even motivated? There's no reason to make such a claim. They're both striving.
All right, you've made that point and you're repeating it. Could you stop now and let me answer it? Okay, I did not say that they're entirely good and he's entirely evil. I didn't use that kind of cartoon language. I said that Gorbachev seemed to sincerely put things on the table and show that he wanted to negotiate these things, and that actions indeed do speak louder than words. He has put a moratorium on nuclear testing. Now, both those political leaders know that when you stop testing, you stop the development of nuclear weapons. Both of them know that, and one of them is willing to take that step, and the other is not. That is indeed actions, and Reagan has taken an action also, and that action is not to stop testing because he wants to continue that escalation, and that is indeed actions speaking louder than words. I'm sorry, I really have to ask you to sit down and let someone else speak.
My question, I have to think it through, has to do with the distance.
Listen, you had a lot of time to do that. You better be quick.
But there's a distance between, which I think in times when for many people, material conditions and experience reality is getting worse, the distance between the perception, the presentation of social reality that appears in the media and that people experience gets wider and wider. And at the same time, the corporations that control the mass media, of course, are going to continue to churn out a certain image that is favorable to the ruling interests. So that there's no national presence of an alternative media. There's not going to be on a large scale. And yet I think that people find ways to keep themselves informed.
Right.
So my question has to do with this. It's sort of like, what do you see as someone who travels a lot, is conscious of many people, how do you see people resisting the kind of framing of their consciousness that goes on, especially when conditions get worse like this? Not in general, but now, in this period of time.
Well, there are several things. One is the limits of propaganda itself. There's just so long you can convince the American people that Gaddafi, for instance, is a mortal threat to the existence of the United States and will destroy us all soon. This little country with about, what, 3 or 4 million people in it. After a while, you can bomb them, try to kill them, and hype it up. And you go around the country and everybody's Gaddafiing. Last spring, people, all they wanted to do was Gaddafi. This is a guy, Libya, they didn't even know where Libya was on the map a few years before, and they were suddenly convinced that it was going to kill him. But after a while, you see, that doesn't work. Gaddafi isn't doing it. He isn't really that terror. It isn't. We now are discovering that most of the brokerage of terrorism and managing of it was supposedly Syria. It turns out it's not even Syria now, that most of it is being done by Iran, and we find out that the President of the United States has been giving arms to the Vatican of terrorism. I mean, to the hub of terrorism. All the while telling people how terrorism is the worst evil. It's a form of communism, really. So you see, they get into lies. There are limits to their propaganda. A lot of that begins to not be as effective as it should. That's one thing. Two, there's a whole alternative networking that goes on. There are church groups, peace groups, labor groups that communicate through newsletters and whatever else. We got 1 million people into New York in June of 19.